The aged steel beneath your feet has felt the tread of 10,000 faithful generations, yet their names remain utterly lost to time. Within the immense, sprawling honeycomb of hive terrors, on the perpetually industrialized world of Corvinus Prime, lies a singular habitation unit, designated 77 Alpha 99998. Measuring a mere 12 meters by 8 meters, with a ceiling 3 meters high, it has been home to a family of 4 for 37 years. Its walls are coated in the prescribed ochre, a hue the administratum, through meticulous calculation, determined would foster both industry and obedience. Now, that paint has begun to flake and peel. This is the narrative of Matthias Vool, a manufacturing worker, grade 7, husband to Sarah and father to the twins, Castor and Lydia. His existence unfolds within these claustrophobic confines, a space where ceiling pipes hiss with scalding water, bound for the nobility in the spires above, where the floor thrums unceasingly with the deep vibrations of heavy machinery 15 levels below, and where, when the lights occasionally falter, the very walls seem to draw a breath. Matthias has known no other home, having been born into 77 Alpha 9998. His father lived here before him, and his grandfather before that. The lease, indelibly stamped and restamped across generations by minor clerks, bears the imperial aquila and the seal of the planetary governor, guaranteeing perpetual occupancy. Provided the tithe quotas are met, the work continues and faith endures. Each morning begins with the same ritualistic precision. The HAB unit's lone chronometer, a brass relic older than living memory, chimes 6 times. Its thin metallic tone is almost swallowed by the ceaseless hum of the ventilation system, which carries the omnipresent sense of promethium, recycled air, and something else entirely, a peculiar, organic, and deeply unsettling odor that Matthias has perceived growing stronger over the recent months. Sarah is the first to stir. At 42, the unrelenting dim lighting and reprocessed air have etched years beyond her true age onto her face. Her hands bear the permanent blue-green stains of the chemicals from the textile mill, where she diligently operates loom 777 for 13 hours a day, 6 days a week. On the 7th day, mandatory attendance at the local shrine demands her presence, where Preacher Hanks recites from the same ancient passages of the imperial creed that have echoed through these corridors for centuries. These sacred words speak of the Emperor's divine love, of humanity's glorious destiny among the stars, and of the colossal work that must be brought to completion. Sarah silently forms the words with lips cracked from the dry, processed air. The twins, now 17, sleep on collapsible cots that each night transform the main living space into their bedroom. Castor labors on the 3rd shift in the plasma conduit maintenance bay, while Lydia meticulously packages ration bars in the nutrition processing center. Both positions were formally assigned to them on their 16th birthday by a local administratum official, a pale man with wire-rimmed spectacles who, after consulting a series of charts, declared their lifelong fates with the chilling indifference of someone merely assessing atmospheric pressure. Neither child has ever ventured beyond sublevel gamma. Neither has witnessed natural sunlight. Neither even comprehends its existence. Matthias dons the regulation gray jumpsuit that unequivocally marks him as a manufacturing worker. The rough fabric chafes against his skin, designed for unyielding durability rather than any semblance of comfort, a concept utterly alien to imperial manufacturing doctrine. Efficiency reigns supreme. Compliance is non-negotiable. Comfort, they teach, is a dangerous luxury, a breeding ground for weakness, and weakness inexorably gives rise to heresy. He fastens his identification tag to his breast pocket. The tag displays his image from 23 years prior, captured on his first day of duty. The young man in that photograph radiates an almost forgotten optimism. The Matthias who confronts his reflection each morning no longer recognizes that distant expression. The kitchen, such as it is, consists of a single counter, a protein synthesizer, and a water reclamation unit. The synthesizer dispenses 3 varieties of food paste: gray, brown, and yellow. The gray provides basic sustenance. The brown is fortified with synthetic proteins. The yellow is supplemented with vitamins designed to ward off the worst maladies associated with artificial nutrition. All 3, without exception, taste precisely the same. The water reclamation unit meticulously converts waste liquids into potable water through a process Matthias neither comprehends nor questions. Understanding is not a prerequisite, only consumption is. Breakfast unfolds in an unbroken silence. This is not born of animosity, but rather because meaningful conversation has become increasingly arduous. What truly is there to discuss? The work remains unchanging. The quotas remain steadfast. The regulations are immutable. Yesterday was an exact replica of today, and tomorrow will be identical to yesterday. This, Preacher Hanks reminds them during services, is the great boon of imperial society, the absolute elimination of uncertainty. Every citizen understands their predefined place, their specific purpose, their precise value to the colossal machine. There is a profound comfort, he insists, in this knowledge, a deep peace in acceptance. Yet, Matthias has begun to discern things that subtly, insidiously disturb this peace. The wall in question, like all the others, was painted the same regulation ochre. It bore the usual minor scuffs and faint stains that inevitably accumulate over decades of continuous habitation. There was nothing visually distinctive about it, save for a small, almost imperceptible crack near the ceiling. One Matthias could not recall ever having noticed before. The fissure was perhaps 15 centimeters long, barely visible unless one knew precisely where to look. When Matthias pressed his ear to the crack, the whispers grew marginally clearer, though the individual words remained frustratingly incomprehensible. His work, paradoxically, offered a temporary sanctuary from these burgeoning concerns. The manufactorum, where Matthias toiled, occupied 7 subterranean levels beneath the residential complex. The daily journey necessitated a 20-minute descent through a bewildering series of lift platforms and interconnecting tunnels. These tunnels were a labyrinthine network lined with service pipes, coiled electrical conduits, and rumbling ventilation shafts that vanished into the perpetual darkness. Occasionally, he would glimpse maintenance crews working in the deeper, more shadowed reaches, their headlamps carving brief, transient pools of light from the pervasive gloom. Matthias had never exchanged a word with these maintenance workers. Their schedules diverged from his, and any conversation between different work classifications was strictly discouraged without proper bureaucratic authorization. The 12-hour work shift concluded as it began, marked by the sharp chime of a chronometer. After a day of relentless labor, the manufactorum workers set down their tools and commenced the arduous journey homeward. The lift platforms carried them slowly upward through the same dark tunnels they had descended that morning. The transition from the harsh, brilliant illumination of the production floor to the dim, amber glow of the residential levels required several minutes of visual adjustment. Some workers instinctively rubbed their aching eyes. Others blinked repeatedly. Matthias merely stared blankly ahead, his mind already irrevocably focused on the evening routine that awaited him. Dinner was prepared by Sarah, who arrived home from the textile mill a mere 30 minutes before Matthias. The meager meal consisted of protein paste, supplemented with synthesized vegetables and a small portion of carbohydrate supplement. The vegetables were cultivated in hydroponic facilities 3 levels beneath the residential complex. They were uniformly pale and utterly flavorless, engineered solely for their nutritional content rather than any appeal to the palate. The workers who tended these critical facilities were classified as agricultural specialists and, in compensation for their vital role in food production, received slightly larger rations. Sarah sometimes found herself idly wondering what it might be like to work in those growing facilities, surrounded by living plants instead of the relentless clatter of mechanical looms. But idle wondering was a far cry from formally requesting a transfer. And transfer requests, she knew, demanded a justification that extended far beyond mere personal preference. Castor returned from his shift just as the family was finishing their meal. His work in the plasma conduit maintenance bay exposed him to radiation levels that, while officially deemed within acceptable parameters, left him in a perpetual state of exhaustion. His skin had acquired a pale, almost translucent quality, making the veins in his forearms visibly prominent. The medical clinic provided monthly screenings for all plasma workers. The results were diligently filed with the appropriate authorities, but were never, under any circumstances, shared directly with the workers themselves. Castor knew only that he had been officially cleared for continued duty. For his purposes, that information was deemed sufficient. Lydia's shift at the Nutrition Processing Center ended long after the others had succumbed to sleep. She returned to the HAB unit near midnight, moving with practiced quietness to avoid disturbing her family. Her work involved the precise sealing of individual ration packages and the accurate application of the corresponding labels. These labels meticulously indicated nutritional content, expiration dates, and distribution designations. Some packages were marked for general consumption. Others were specifically labeled for designated populations: children, pregnant women, workers in hazardous industries, clergy members, military personnel. The quality of the rations varied subtly, but undeniably, according to the recipient's perceived value to imperial society. This variation was never openly discussed, yet every citizen, through direct, lived experience, instinctively understood the hierarchy. The evening hours in 77 Alpha 9998 adhered to an immutable pattern. Sarah diligently performed maintenance tasks, cleaning the synthesizer filters, checking the water reclamation unit, and inspecting the HAB unit for any signs of wear or damage. Matthias reviewed his work documentation, meticulously filling out production reports and quality control forms. The twins studied technical manuals relevant to their respective positions, committing safety protocols and efficiency standards to memory. Education, in any traditional sense, had ended for all of them years ago, but continuous training was an absolute mandate for all imperial citizens. Knowledge that did not serve the emperor's grand purposes was knowledge utterly wasted. But tonight, as Matthias struggled to focus on his documentation, the whispers returned. They began, as they always did, soft, indistinct, seemingly coalescing from the very fabric of the walls themselves. Yet tonight, there was an unsettling difference. Tonight, the whispers carried a new note of urgency, an almost desperate, pleading quality. Matthias quietly set aside his data slate and moved closer to the wall. Sarah, utterly absorbed in her cleaning tasks, remained oblivious to his movement. Castor had already collapsed onto his cot, his breathing shallow and labored from the day's radiation exposure. Pressing his ear against the cold wall, Matthias listened intently. The whispers were undeniably emanating from behind the surface, but their true source remained maddeningly unclear. They could be originating from HAB Unit 77 Alpha 9997, but the Korvac family comprised only 3 members: Hrick, his wife Elena, and their daughter Mira. The voices Matthias heard seemed far more numerous, perhaps 6 or even 7 distinct speakers. Their words overlapped and interwove in complex, maddening patterns that rendered individual phrases almost impossible to distinguish. The crack in the wall had visibly lengthened. Where it had once been a mere 15 centimeters long, it now extended nearly 30 centimeters toward the floor. The edges of the crack were not the clean, sharp breaks one would expect from structural settling. Instead, they appeared almost organic, curved and irregularly branched, like the grotesque tendrils of a diseased tree. When Matthias tentatively ran his finger along the crack, the surface felt unnervingly warm to the touch. This, he knew, should be utterly impossible. The interior walls were not connected to any heating systems, and the ambient temperature of the HAB unit remained meticulously regulated at a constant 18 degrees Celsius. Over the ensuing weeks, Matthias began to notice a cascade of other insidious changes within 77 Alpha 9998. The protein synthesizer occasionally produced batches of paste that carried a faint, disturbing odor of decay. The water from the reclamation unit sometimes had a distinct metallic taste that lingered unpleasantly for hours. Even the chronometer, which had maintained flawless accuracy for decades, began to inexplicably run slow, losing several minutes each day. Most profoundly disturbing of all, Sarah and the twins seemed utterly oblivious to these accumulating anomalies. When Matthias tentatively mentioned the strange smells or unusual tastes, they regarded him with expressions of confusion and mild, almost pitying concern. The work continued, as it always had. The manufactorum operated with the unyielding precision of schedules meticulously established by the administratum and rigorously enforced by shift supervisors, who in turn answered to production coordinators, who reported to sector chiefs, who served at the pleasure of the planetary governor. This intricate chain of command extended relentlessly upward through countless layers of bureaucracy, until it reached the highest echelons of imperial authority. At each successive level, decisions were rendered based upon data provided by the level below. Information flowed ever upward, filtered, processed, and condensed into sterile reports that bore agonizingly little resemblance to the gritty, often brutal reality experienced by individual workers on the ground. Assembly Station 47 continued its relentless output of guidance systems for artillery shells. The quota remained constant, 47 units per shift. The quality standards remained uncompromising, zero tolerance for defects or deviations. The work rhythm maintained its steady, hypnotic cadence: insert, align, seal, test, pass. But Matthias found his concentration inexorably wavering. His thoughts returned repeatedly to the insistent whispers, to the ever-growing crack, to the subtle yet profound changes in his home that no one else seemed capable of perceiving. During the third week, shift supervisor Vela, a gaunt woman who had held her position for 8 unwavering years, finally noticed Matthias's unsettling distraction. She approached his station during a scheduled inspection, her data slate poised to record any observations or violations. "Worker Vool," she stated, her voice barely audible above the deafening machinery noise. "Your completion rate has dropped by 7% over the past 10 days. Matthias, without breaking his rhythm, continued his work as he responded. Stopping to face a supervisor during inspection is considered disrespectful and can result in disciplinary action. His voice was flat. "I was not aware of the decline, Supervisor Vela. I will increase my focus to correct the deficiency." Vela's stern voice cut through the din. "Production standards exist for the benefit of the Emperor and the citizens he protects. When one worker fails to meet quota, all workers must compensate for the shortfall. This creates inefficiency and reduces overall output. I understand, Supervisor. The deficiency will be corrected." Vela made swift, precise notes on her data slate. These notes, Matthias knew, would become an indelible part of his permanent work record, accessible to any future supervisor or administrator needing to evaluate his performance. 3 negative evaluations within a 6-month period mandated re-education. 5 negative evaluations resulted in job reassignment. 7 negative evaluations led to review by the local arbitrator, whose options included fines, imprisonment, or, in extreme cases, servitorization. The pervasive knowledge of this unforgiving system did not inspire fear in imperial citizens, for fear would imply doubt about the wisdom of imperial justice. Instead, it instilled a meticulous attention to duty and an unshakable adherence to regulation. Matthias, in his 23 years of service, had received only 2 negative evaluations, both for minor documentation errors. His work record was, by manufacturing standards, exemplary. This recent decline in performance represented a profound anomaly that demanded correction. Yet, correction proved agonizingly difficult when one's attention was relentlessly drawn to mysteries that, by all imperial decree, should simply not exist. The whispers had begun to invade even the daylight hours. What was once a disturbing nocturnal phenomenon now intruded upon the mundane routines of home life. Matthias heard them while eating breakfast, while preparing for work, while attempting to complete his evening documentation. The voices seemed to be calling to him specifically, though the words themselves remained agonizingly incomprehensible. Sometimes he would catch fleeting fragments that sounded almost like his own name, drawn out and distorted as if spoken through murky water or thick, distorting glass. Sarah had begun to express her concern about his increasingly erratic behavior. During their brief, ritualistic evening conversations, she would mention his disconcerting tendency to stare blankly at walls, his profound distraction during meals, his peculiar habit of pressing his ear to surfaces as if intently listening for something unseen. Her concern was genuine, yet inherently limited. Imperial citizens were not trained in psychological analysis or mental health assessment. Such specialized knowledge was strictly reserved for medical specialists and clergy members who served very specific functions within the imperial hierarchy. Sarah knew only that her husband's behavior had changed, and any change without a clear, sanctioned cause was always inherently troubling. "Perhaps you should speak with Preacher Hanks," she suggested one evening as they prepared for sleep. "He has experienced counseling workers who suffer from spiritual difficulties." The suggestion was, by all imperial standards, reasonable. Preacher Hanks had served the local shrine for 12 years and had guided many citizens through periods of doubt or confusion. His approach combined scriptural wisdom with eminently practical advice, aimed at helping troubled souls reconcile their personal struggles with their sacred imperial duties. But Matthias was deeply reluctant to involve religious authority in what he instinctively felt might be a purely practical, albeit terrifying, matter. Preacher Hanks, Matthias knew, was bound by strict regulation to report certain categories of problems to higher authorities: spiritual corruption, heretical thoughts, signs of mutation, or overt psychic manifestation all fell squarely within his mandatory reporting requirements. "I will consider your suggestion," Matthias told Sarah, though he knew it was a lie. "But I believe the difficulty will resolve itself with time." This was not entirely truthful. Matthias did not believe the difficulty would resolve itself. If anything, he suspected it would continue to intensify. The crack in the wall grew visibly longer each day. The whispers became more frequent, more urgent. The changes in his home environment became more pronounced, more undeniable. But admitting these escalating concerns to Sarah would only spread the disquiet and potential danger to another family member, and Matthias was not at all certain that would be wise. The solution, he finally decided, was independent investigation. This decision to investigate did not come easily, for imperial citizens were meticulously trained from birth to report unusual phenomena directly to the appropriate authorities, rather than attempting any form of independent analysis. The chain of reporting was clearly, unequivocally defined. Citizens reported to local administrators. Administrators reported to sector coordinators. Coordinators reported to planetary officials. Officials reported to subsector commands. Commands, in turn, reported directly to the imperial governors themselves. At each successive level, specialized expertise was supposedly applied to determine the most appropriate responses. This rigidly structured system had, by all accounts, functioned effectively for 10 millennia, maintaining an iron grip of stability across millions of worlds and trillions of citizens. But the system implicitly assumed that citizens would, in fact, recognize unusual phenomena when they encountered them. Matthias was not entirely certain that what he was experiencing truly qualified as unusual. The whispers, he tried to rationalize, could simply be explained by acoustic effects within the building's ancient, aging structure. The growing crack might merely be the result of normal structural settling or thermal expansion. The disconcerting changes in taste and smell could be attributed to minor equipment malfunctions or perhaps even his own heightened sensitivity due to mounting stress. Without clear, irrefutable evidence of a genuine threat, reporting his amorphous concerns might be deemed premature and could very well result in unnecessary, intrusive investigations of his family and neighbors. His self-initiated investigation began with meticulous, almost obsessive observation. Matthias started diligently documenting the whispers, their precise timing, their duration, their apparent source location, and any words or phrases he could faintly distinguish. He measured the crack in the wall each evening, carefully noting its incremental growth rate and any subtle changes in its physical characteristics. He rigorously monitored the protein synthesizer and the water reclamation unit, recording every variation in their output quality. His approach was methodical, systematic, and thoroughly analytical, a direct application of the quality control principles ingrained in all manufacturing workers. The painstaking documentation, however, began to reveal patterns that profoundly disturbed him. The whispers occurred most frequently between 2200 hours and 0200 hours, precisely during the period when most residents were deep in sleep. The crack grew at a steady rate of approximately 2 centimeters per day, but its growth noticeably accelerated during the very episodes of the whispers. Furthermore, the equipment malfunctions correlated unsettlingly with both the whispers and the crack's growth, strongly suggesting a direct, horrifying connection between all three phenomena. Most troubling of all, Matthias discovered that he could, with increasing clarity, sometimes understand individual words within the whispers. They spoke of an insatiable hunger, of an abyssal darkness, of forbidden spaces between spaces where the Emperor's divine light simply did not reach. They uttered names that sounded almost familiar, yet which he could not quite place. They described impossible places that seemed to exist within the very walls themselves, vast cyclopean caverns and impossibly twisted corridors that extended far, far beyond the physical boundaries of the residential complex. This was the terrifying moment Matthias fully comprehended that his situation might require far more than individual investigation. The local administrative office occupied. Matthias's destination was the third sublevel of the sprawling government complex, a facility positioned a dozen stories above the city's residential districts. Yet, even at this height, it remained dwarfed by the towering spire, an untouchable eyrie where the most esteemed planetary officials conducted their clandestine affairs. This particular office was tasked with serving citizens across 7 distinct residential sectors, diligently handling their various bureaucratic needs, from processing routine documentation and logging complaint reports to managing a multitude of administrative requests. Within the waiting area, precisely 40 seats were meticulously arranged in neat, regimented rows, all facing a long service counter where 3 attentive clerks stood ready. These seats were predominantly occupied by citizens, each holding an assortment of forms and documents, patiently awaiting the call of their designated number. Matthias clutched his complaint form, 777 Delta, a meticulously completed document, replicated in triplicate as stringent regulations demanded. The form itself was designed for reporting a range of issues within his assigned HAB unit, encompassing noise disturbances, minor structural anomalies, equipment malfunctions, or other habitability concerns. He had filled out the extensive form with painstaking care, choosing his words precisely. The unsettling whispers were logged as unusual acoustic phenomena, the developing crack as a minor structural irregularity, and the equipment failures as intermittent performance variations. His language was deliberately neutral and technical, carefully avoiding any phrasing that might hint at supernatural occurrences or heretical origins. When his number was finally called, Matthias approached the service counter. There, Clark Valdreris, a middle-aged man with visibly thinning hair and fingers perpetually stained with ink, began to review his documentation. HAB Unit 77, Alpha 9998, Clerk Valdreris intoned, reading aloud. Acoustic phenomena, structural irregularity, equipment variations. How long have these issues been ongoing? Approximately 6 weeks for the acoustic phenomena, 4 weeks for the structural issue, and 3 weeks for the equipment problems, Matthias responded. Clerk Valdris made precise notes on his data slate. Have you consulted with your neighbors regarding similar experiences? This was a standard procedural question, designed to ascertain whether reported problems were isolated incidents affecting single units or indicative of broader issues. Matthias admitted he had not. The Korvac family in 77 Alpha 9997 worked different shifts, making chance encounters in the corridors rare. The Brennies family in 77 Alpha 9999 consisted of an elderly couple who maintained a reclusive lifestyle, communicating primarily through written notes left outside their HAB unit. I have not consulted with neighbors, Matthias reiterated. Investigation protocol requires neighbor consultation before administrative review, Clerk Valdris explained, his tone firm but not unkind. Please complete verification form 222 Alpha with statements from adjacent residents, then return for processing. This additional form mandated that Matthias obtain written statements from the residents of HAB units 77 Alpha 9997 and 77 Alpha 9999, confirming whether they too had experienced similar problems. These statements had to be signed and dated, with official identification numbers included for verification. Only after this step could the administration proceed with a formal investigation of his complaint. This requirement introduced complications Matthias had not foreseen. Approaching neighbors about potentially sensitive matters demanded careful consideration of privacy regulations and intricate social protocols. Citizens were expected to maintain appropriate boundaries with their neighbors while simultaneously cooperating on matters of mutual concern. The balance between these expectations was delicate, and any miscalculation could result in social difficulties or administrative complications. His decision to approach the Korvac family proved problematic from the outset. Matthias knocked on the door of 77 Alpha 9997 during the evening, the time he believed they would be returning home from their second shift assignments. The knock was answered not by Hendrik or Elena Korvac, but by a young woman he did not recognize. She appeared to be in her 20s, with pale skin and dark hair pulled back in a simple braid. Her clothing was standard civilian issue, yet something in her demeanor suggested she was not a regular resident of the complex. "Yes?" she inquired, opening the door only wide enough to reveal her face. "I am Matthias Vuhl from 77 Alpha 9998. I am seeking to speak with the Korvac family regarding an administrative matter." The young woman's expression remained impassive, but she glanced briefly over her shoulder before responding. "The Korvacs are not available at this time. Perhaps you could return at a more convenient hour. They enki the sort de na." This response struck Matthias as unusual. Citizens working second shifts were typically available during evening hours, and administrative matters usually received priority attention, regardless of convenience. Matthias considered pressing for more specific information about when the Korvacs might be available, but something in the young woman's guarded manner discouraged further inquiry. "May I ask when would be a more convenient time?" he asked instead. "I will inform them of your visit," she replied. "They will contact you if they wish to discuss the matter." The door closed before Matthias could respond. He stood in the corridor for several moments, contemplating the implications of this brief encounter. The young woman could be a visiting relative or friend, though such visits usually required advanced registration with building management. She could also be a temporary resident assigned to the unit for official purposes, though such assignments were typically announced to neighboring units for security reasons. Or, most unsettling, she could be someone who should not be in the building at all. The encounter with the Brennis family proved equally unsatisfactory, though for entirely different reasons. When Matthias knocked on the door of 77 Alpha 9999, he was greeted by Marcus Brennis, an elderly man whose work history included 25 years in an atmospheric processing plant before his current assignment to document filing duties. Marcus listened politely to Matthias's explanation of the administrative requirement, but his response revealed further complications. "Unusual sounds, you say?" Marcus asked, a note of genuine concern in his voice. "Elena and I have noticed some irregularities in our own unit, primarily related to temperature fluctuations and occasional electrical anomalies. This information was both helpful and troubling. Helpful because it suggested that Matthias's experiences might not be isolated to his own HAB unit, implying a potentially wider problem. Troubling because it hinted at a broader issue that could affect the entire residential complex. Marcus readily agreed to provide a written statement for the verification form, but his willingness to cooperate came with an unexpected request. Perhaps we should coordinate our efforts, Marcus suggested. If multiple units are experiencing problems, a joint complaint might receive more serious attention from the administration. The suggestion was reasonable from an efficiency standpoint, but it represented a significant expansion of what Matthias had originally intended as a simple individual complaint. Joint complaints required additional documentation, coordination between multiple families, and potentially greater scrutiny from administrative authorities. They also implied a level of organization among residents that could be interpreted as unauthorized assembly for collective action. Imperial regulations regarding collective action were complex and situation-dependent. Citizens had the right to band together for legitimate purposes such as work assignments, religious observance, and community maintenance. However, they also had the obligation to avoid unauthorized organization that could challenge established authority or create alternative power structures. The distinction between legitimate cooperation and unauthorized assembly was not always clear, and citizens were expected to exercise careful judgment in determining appropriate levels of coordination. After careful consideration, Matthias agreed to Marcus's suggestion. The potential benefits of a coordinated approach outweighed the risks, particularly if the problems affecting his HAB unit were indeed part of a larger pattern. Marcus's extensive experience with administrative procedures, gained through his document filing work, could prove invaluable in navigating the complaint process. His evident willingness to cooperate also suggested that the problems were significant enough to warrant formal attention. The joint complaint required 3 days to prepare properly. Marcus and Matthias met each evening after their respective work shifts to compare their observations and compile their documentation. These meetings took place in the corridor outside their HAB units, as regulations discouraged extended visits between families without proper authorization. Their conversations were conducted in low voices to avoid disturbing other residents, though Matthias couldn't help but notice that the corridor seemed unusually empty during their meeting times. The documentation that emerged from their collaboration revealed a pattern far more disturbing than either man had initially suspected. Marcus's electrical anomalies corresponded closely to the timing of Matthias's whispers. Both families had experienced equipment malfunctions that followed strikingly similar patterns. Most significantly, Marcus reported structural irregularities in his own HAB unit. Specifically, a crack in the wall that separated his living area from 77 Alpha 9998. The crack in Marcus's wall was approximately 45 centimeters long, extending from floor level toward the ceiling. Like the crack in Matthias's wall, it exhibited organic-looking curves rather than straight structural breaks. Marcus had measured its growth rate and discovered that it expanded at approximately 2 centimeters per day, the exact same rate that Matthias had documented in his own unit. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental, but the most disturbing discovery came when Marcus described sounds he had been hearing from within the wall. They were not whispers like those experienced by Matthias, but rather a rhythmic scratching noise accompanied by what sounded unmistakably like breathing. These sounds occurred during the same time periods as Matthias's whispers, suggesting that both phenomena originated from the same source located somewhere between the two hobby units. This raised troubling questions about the nature of the space between the walls. According to the building's architectural plans, available for review at the local administrative office, the walls of adjacent HAB units were separated by 15 centimeters of insulation material and structural support elements. This space was not designed to accommodate any form of activity or habitation. It existed purely for building integrity and environmental isolation between units. Yet the sounds reported by both men suggested the presence of something within this space, something that moved, breathed, and possibly spoke. Something that, by any reasonable understanding of the building's design and function, simply should not exist. The joint complaint, meticulously completed in the required quintuplicate format, represented the most thorough documentation either man had ever submitted to administrative authority. It included detailed measurements, time logs, correlation analysis, and supporting statements from both families. The language remained carefully neutral and technical, studiously avoiding any implications of supernatural or heretical causes. The request was simple: investigation by qualified authorities and appropriate remedial action to restore normal habitability conditions. Clerk Valdris reviewed the joint complaint with visible interest. The thoroughness of the documentation clearly impressed him, and he asked several detailed questions about measurement methodology and observational procedures. His questions suggested professional curiosity rather than skepticism, and Matthias began to hope that their complaint would receive serious attention. "This type of coordinated documentation is exceptional," Clerk Valdris commented as he reviewed the final pages. "Most citizen complaints lack sufficient detail for proper evaluation. Your approach demonstrates admirable dedication to administrative efficiency." The praise was gratifying, but Matthias remained focused on practical outcomes. What is the expected timeline for investigation and resolution? Standard protocol requires initial assessment within 10 working days, Valdris explained. Depending on the findings, additional investigation may be required. Complex structural or environmental issues sometimes require specialist consultation, which can extend the process considerably. 10 working days represented 2 full work weeks, during which the problems in both HAB units would presumably continue to develop. The cracks would grow larger, the sounds would become more frequent, and whatever existed in the space between the walls would have additional time to establish itself more firmly. This timeline was not ideal, but it represented the best outcome available through official channels. As Matthias and Marcus left the administrum office, both men understood that they had committed themselves to a process whose conclusion remained uncertain. Their joint complaint had been filed and accepted, but official investigation might reveal problems that required solutions far beyond simple maintenance or repair. If the issues in their HAB units were connected to larger structural problems, they could face relocation to different residential areas. If the problems were attributed to equipment age or design flaws, they could face assessments for upgrade costs that exceeded their financial resources. Most troubling of all, if the investigation revealed problems that could not be explained through conventional means, they could face questioning about their own role in creating or discovering these phenomena. Imperial authorities were trained to consider all possibilities when evaluating unusual circumstances, including the unsettling possibility that citizens reporting problems might themselves be part of the problem. But these concerns had to be balanced against the certainty that ignoring the growing problems would only make them worse. The whispers in Matthias's wall had become more frequent and more urgent. The cracks in both units continued to expand. The equipment malfunctions had begun to affect the quality of food and water that both families depended upon for survival. Whatever was happening in 77 Alpha 9998 and 77 Alpha 999 could not be allowed to continue indefinitely. The investigation, when it finally began, revealed the true scope of the problem. Administrative investigator Teresa Vance arrived at the residential complex on the morning of the 8th working day after the complaint was filed. She was accompanied by building inspector Jonas Kreiber and technical specialist Lysa Morrison, an escort that indicated the administrum had taken the joint complaint seriously enough to assign a full investigation team. The team carried specialized equipment for structural assessment, environmental analysis, and meticulous documentation of their findings. Matthias and Marcus met the investigation team in the corridor outside their respective HAB units. Both men had taken leave from their work assignments for the day, as their presence presence was required for the full duration of the investigation. The loss of a day's wages represented a financial hardship for both families, but cooperation with official investigations was mandatory and took precedence over individual economic concerns. Investigator Vance began the process by reviewing the joint complaint and asking detailed questions about the timeline and nature of each reported problem. Her questions were professional and thorough, covering aspects of the situation that neither Matthias nor Marcus had considered significant. She inquired about changes in sleep patterns, variations in appetite, and any unusual dreams or thoughts that might correlate with the onset of the problems. Her questions suggested experience with cases that extended beyond simple structural or equipment issues. The physical investigation commenced with Inspector Kreiber's assessment of the cracks in both HAB units. Using precision measuring instruments, he confirmed the dimensions and growth rates documented by the residents, but his examination revealed additional details that were not visible to untrained observation. The cracks did not follow the normal patterns associated with structural settling or thermal expansion. Instead, they appeared to follow the path of least resistance through the wall material, creating curved channels that maximized surface area while minimizing overt structural damage. This is not typical crack propagation, Inspector Kreiber explained to the team. The pattern suggests external pressure applied from within the wall space, but the building specifications indicate no surfaces or structural elements that could generate such pressure. Technical specialist Morrison began her environmental analysis with readings from instruments Matthias did not recognize. She measured air composition, temperature gradients, electromagnetic fields, and acoustic signatures throughout both HAB units. Her equipment produced a series of soft beeping sounds and displayed data on small screens that she studied with growing concentration. Atmospheric anomalies in both units, Morrison reported after completing her initial survey. Elevated humidity levels inconsistent with building environmental controls, trace organic compounds of unknown origin, low-frequency acoustic emissions that do not correlate with any mechanical systems in the building. The investigation team exchanged glances that suggested these findings were not entirely unexpected. Investigator Vance made detailed notes on her data slate while Inspector Kreiber photographed the cracks from multiple angles. Morrison continued her readings, moving methodically through both HAB units with her instruments. It was Morrison who ultimately discovered the most disturbing evidence. Using a fiber optic probe inserted into the crack in Matthias's wall, she was able to examine the interior space between the HAB units. What she saw there contradicted every assumption about the building's construction and occupancy. The space between the walls is not the narrow gap filled with insulation material shown on the architectural plans. Instead, it opens into a cavity that extends far beyond the building's documented dimensions, Morrison reported, her voice carrying a note of professional concern. The interior space appears to be significantly larger than indicated by construction records. I'm detecting air movement consistent with a much more extensive hollow area. The probe is encountering no resistance after 2 meters of extension, which should be impossible given the building's structural design. Investigator Vance requested a more detailed probe examination. Morrison inserted additional equipment into the crack, including a miniature camera that could transmit images back to her monitoring screen. The images that appeared on the screen showed a space that defied rational explanation. The cavity extended upward and downward beyond the range of the camera's illumination. The walls were not the clean metal and rock-rete surfaces one would expect from construction materials, but rather appeared organic in nature, with textures that seemed to shift and change when observed directly. The air within the space moved in patterns that suggested ventilation or circulation, though no mechanical systems were visible. Most disturbing of all, the camera detected movement within the cavity, shadows that crossed the field of view without apparent sources, shapes that seemed almost recognizable before disappearing into the darkness. At one point, the camera captured what appeared to be text or symbols carved into the organic wall surfaces, but the characters were not in any language that Morrison recognized. "I need to report these findings to Sector Command immediately," Investigator Vance announced after reviewing Morrison's documentation. "This investigation exceeds the scope of standard habitability assessment." The implications of this statement were not lost on Matthias or Marcus. When administrative investigations exceeded standard scope, they typically escalated to authorities with specialized expertise and enhanced legal powers. This could mean involvement by the ecclesiarchy if the problems were deemed to have spiritual implications. It could mean involvement by the Adeptus Mechanicus if the issues related to technological heresy. It could even mean involvement by the Inquisition if the circumstances suggested corruption by chaos or Xenos influence. While Investigator Vance communicated with her superiors via secured Vox link, Inspector Kreiber continued his structural assessment of both HAB units. His examination revealed that the anomalous cracks were not isolated to the walls between the units. Similar fissures, smaller but following the same organic patterns, had begun to appear in other locations throughout both residences. Floor-to-ceiling cracks near the entrance doors, ceiling-to-floor cracks along the exterior walls, horizontal cracks that followed the junction between walls and floors. The building, it appeared, was developing a network of interconnected openings that corresponded to no known structural phenomena. The cracks were not random damage from age or settling, but rather seemed to follow a deliberate pattern that served some unknown purpose. They were creating pathways through the solid structure of the building, connecting spaces that were never intended to be connected. Technical specialist Morrison's continued monitoring revealed that the environmental anomalies were spreading beyond the two HAB units under investigation. Her instruments detected similar atmospheric irregularities in adjacent residences, though the residents of those units had not yet reported problems to the Administrum. This suggested either that the problems were in their early stages in other locations or that other residents were experiencing difficulties but had not yet sought official assistance. The investigation team spent 6 hours documenting their findings before Investigator Vance received a response from Sector Command. The response, delivered via encrypted data transmission, contained instructions that she did not share with Matthias or Marcus. Instead, she informed them that their HAB units were being classified as temporarily uninhabitable, pending specialized assessment, and that they must relocate to alternative accommodations within 48 hours. The relocation order was not entirely unexpected, but its urgency suggested that the authorities considered the situation to be immediately hazardous. Matthias and Marcus were provided with housing requisition forms that would allow their families to claim temporary residence in vacant units within other residential complexes. The temporary housing was guaranteed for 30 days, after which their status would be reviewed based on the results of the specialized assessment. But, as the investigation team prepared to leave, Morrison made one final chilling discovery that changed everything. Using her instruments to conduct a final survey of Matthias's HAB unit, she detected thermal signatures that indicated the unmistakable presence of living organisms within the wall spaces. The signatures were not consistent with known pest species or small animals that might have infiltrated the building structure. Instead, they suggested creatures of considerable size, possibly human-sized, that maintained body temperatures slightly below normal human ranges. There's something alive in there, Morrison announced, her professional composure finally showing signs of strain. Multiple entities, possibly 6 or 7 individuals based on thermal reading distribution. They appear to be arranged in a pattern that corresponds to the acoustic phenomena reported by the residents. The whispers that Matthias had been hearing were not random sounds transmitted through the building structure. They were communications between living beings who had somehow taken up residence within the walls of his home, beings who had been watching his family, listening to their conversations, observing their daily routines through cracks that they had systematically widened to serve as observation ports. Investigator Vance immediately contacted Sector Command with this new information. The response was swift and unambiguous. The residential complex was to be evacuated immediately, pending the arrival of specialized response teams. All residents were to be relocated to temporary housing facilities where they could be interviewed individually about their experiences and observations. The building itself was to be sealed and placed under administrative quarantine. The evacuation began within hours of the investigation team's departure. Official notices were posted in every corridor, informing residents that they had 12 hours to gather essential possessions and report to designated assembly points for transport to temporary facilities. The notices cited urgent maintenance requirements as the reason for evacuation, making no mention of the true, terrifying circumstances that had prompted this action. Matthias packed his family's possessions with hands that shook despite his attempts to maintain composure. Sarah asked questions that he could not answer without revealing information he had been explicitly instructed not to discuss. The twins accepted the situation with the adaptability of youth, treating the relocation as an unexpected adventure rather than a potential crisis. But as Matthias loaded their belongings into the transport vehicle that would carry them to temporary housing, he could not escape the knowledge that they were leaving behind more than just a home. They were leaving behind something that had been watching them, learning about them, possibly preparing for some action that the evacuation was intended to prevent. The beings in the walls remained in place, their purposes unknown, their capabilities undetermined. The temporary housing facility occupied a converted manufacturing complex in a different sector of the Hive City. The accommodations were Spartan but adequate, single rooms with basic amenities. The temporary housing provided communal dining facilities and shared recreation areas, yet the residents from 77 Alpha 9998 and other evacuated HAB units were conspicuously segregated from the general population. This arrangement strongly implied that the authorities regarded them as requiring either specialized monitoring or enhanced protection, setting them apart from ordinary citizens. On the second day of their relocation, individual interviews commenced. Matthias found himself interrogated by a team of officials whose identities and departmental affiliations remained deliberately undisclosed. Their questioning delved into intricate details of his time within the HAB unit, his personal observations of any unusual phenomena, and his interactions with neighbors and family. The interviews were exhaustive and methodical, probing facets of his experience he had previously dismissed as inconsequential. A particular focus for the interviewers was Matthias's accounts of the whispers and his unusual capacity to discern individual words or phrases within them. They pressed him to recount every auditory memory, to describe the voices with the utmost clarity, and even to theorize about the communication's underlying meaning or intent. The nature of their inquiries hinted at a pre-existing knowledge of similar incidents or established theoretical models for such phenomena. Yet, when Matthias ventured to inquire about the findings of the specialized assessment conducted on his HAB unit, the officials offered only nebulous assurances that the matter was under the purview of the appropriate authorities. He received no enlightenment regarding the thermal signatures, whether the entities within the walls had been identified or neutralized, nor any timeline for residents to potentially return home. The flow of information was unequivocally unidirectional, from the anxious evacuated residents to the inscrutable investigating authorities. Sarah and the twins also endured comparable interviews, albeit their sessions were considerably briefer, reflecting their more limited exposure to the anomalous phenomena. Sierra reported perceiving nothing out of the ordinary within the HAB unit, aside from her husband's progressively erratic conduct. The twins likewise reported no direct encounters with whispers, structural fissures, or other irregularities. This consistent pattern among the majority of evacuated residents suggested that the phenomena were manifesting selectively to specific individuals rather than broadly impacting the entire population uniformly. Marcus Bernice, whose meticulous documentation and observations formed crucial evidence for the joint complaint that sparked the investigation, underwent the most exhaustive questioning. His interview sessions spanned 3 full days, during which he was tasked with reviewing intricate architectural plans, scrutinizing photographs of analogous cases from other residential complexes, and offering detailed analyses of his recorded measurements and observations. The profound depth of this interrogation strongly implied that his particular case carried broader implications, extending well beyond their immediate predicament. The temporary housing facility was governed by regulations overtly designed to discourage extensive communication among residents concerning their previous experiences. Meals were served in staggered shifts, specifically separating families who had occupied adjacent HAB units. Recreation activities were meticulously scheduled to minimize any opportunities for coordinated discussion regarding the evacuation circumstances. While these measures were officially presented as mere temporary administrative conveniences, their undeniable effect was to proactively prevent residents from sharing vital information or cultivating any collective understanding of their unsettling situation. 3 weeks into their relocation, Matthias received official notification that his family had been approved for permanent rehousing in an entirely different residential complex. Their new assignment was situated in sublevel Delta, 2 levels above their former home, yet otherwise comparable in size and amenities. The comprehensive notification detailed transportation arrangements, utility connection schedules, and work assignment transfers for all family members to new positions within nearby facilities. While this permanent rehousing undeniably represented a significant upgrade in their living conditions, it simultaneously sealed their fate. They would never return to 77 Alpha 9998. Whatever had transpired in their former home, whatever continued to unfold within its walls, they would not be privy to its resolution. They were being moved irrevocably beyond the reach of whatever enigmatic phenomenon had afflicted their previous residents, but by the same token, they were also being moved beyond any possibility of truly understanding what that phenomenon represented. The day before their scheduled relocation to the new HAB unit, Matthias unexpectedly encountered Investigator Vance in the austere corridor of the temporary housing facility. She was flanked by 2 other officials, seemingly engaged in a final inspection of the premises. Upon noticing Matthias, she approached him, her expression conveying what might have been genuine concern or perhaps just impeccable professional obligation. "Mr. Vogue," she began, her voice retaining the same unwavering professional tone he recalled from their initial meeting. "I wanted to personally convey that your cooperation throughout the investigation has been truly exemplary. Your meticulous documentation and astute observations contribute significantly to our understanding of the situation." Matthias thanked her for the acknowledgement, then posed the question that had gnawed at him relentlessly for weeks. Was the problem resolved? Are the other residents truly safe? Investigator Vance paused, carefully weighing her response before speaking. "The situation has been contained through appropriate measures," she stated. "The residents who were relocated are safe and will remain safe in their new accommodations. That is the full extent of information I am authorized to provide." The subtle distinction between contained and resolved did not escape Matthias's attention. Containment implied that whatever malevolence had resided within the walls of his former home persisted, yet had been effectively prevented from spreading or instigating further issues. It suggested that the enigmatic beings whose whispers he had endured for months remained in situ, perhaps hermetically sealed within their strange organic cavities, perhaps continuing their inscrutable activities beyond the impenetrable veil of human observation. "Will other residential complexes be inspected for similar problems?" Matthias pressed, unwilling to let the conversation end. "Appropriate precautionary measures are being implemented across all relevant facilities," Vance replied, her tone unyielding. "Citizens should continue to report unusual phenomena through established channels. The Emperor protects those who remain vigilant in their service to the Imperium." Her answer was a textbook example of the standard formula employed in imperial official communications, acknowledging the existence of problems without divulging specific information about their true nature or full extent. It was the precise type of response imperial citizens were trained to interpret as tacit confirmation that serious issues indeed existed, but that individual citizens were neither expected to fully comprehend nor directly address these profound matters. The conversation concluded with predictable mutual expressions of respect and duty. Yet Matthias was left with an unshakable certainty. His fundamental questions would never be fully answered. The official record, he knew, would merely state that SHAB Unit 77 Alpha 9998 had experienced structural and environmental problems, necessitating resident relocation and specialized remediation. The true nature of what had inhabited the walls, what insidious desires it harbored, what potential devastation it might have wrought had it remained undiscovered, would persist as highly classified information, accessible solely to those possessing the appropriate security clearances and demonstrable operational necessity. Their new HAB unit, located in sublevel Delta, was officially designated 44 Beta 775, measuring a spacious 14 meters by 10 meters. With a ceiling height of 3.5 meters, it represented a tangible and welcome improvement over their previous cramped accommodations. The walls were painted a regulation ochre, yet the paint was pristine, fresh, and utterly unmarked. The protein synthesizer reliably produced food paste that tasted precisely as it should, devoid of any strange impurities. The water reclamation unit delivered clean, potable water, free from unusual odors or metallic aftertastes. Even the chronometer maintained perfect, unblemished accuracy. Matthias's new work assignment placed him at Assembly Station 23, within an entirely different manufactorum complex. The labor itself was identical to his previous position, meticulously installing guidance systems into artillery shells destined for Imperial Guard units deployed on distant, war-torn worlds. The quotum remained an unyielding 47 units per shift, and the quality standards continued to demand zero tolerance for even the slightest defect. The familiar, relentless rhythm of insert, align, seal, test, pass, persisted, just as it always had. Yet, on quiet evenings, when Sarah and the twins were absorbed in their own activities, Matthias invariably found himself listening intently to the walls of 44 Beta 775. He would press his ear against the pristine ochre-painted surfaces, straining to detect even the faintest sound that did not belong. The walls remained utterly silent, containing nothing but the approved insulation materials and robust structural support specified in the building's meticulous architectural plans. Still, sometimes, in the deep hours of the night, when even the building's ceaseless mechanical systems seemed to briefly fall silent, Matthias imagined he could perceive something shifting in the liminal spaces between spaces. Not within his own walls, he reassured himself, but somewhere else. In the sprawling, enigmatic honeycomb of the hive city. Somewhere in the suffocating darkness between residential levels, in the forgotten maintenance tunnels, in the long sealed areas that no longer materialized on any official map. The whispers, Matthias knew with chilling certainty, may have been contained, but they had definitively not been silenced. They persisted, echoing in other unseen locations, subtly calling out to other residents who lay awake in their regulation beds, tormented by sounds that seemed to emanate from within the very walls themselves. Citizens who would, in due time, begin to notice hairline cracks, growing perceptibly larger each day, essential equipment producing strange tastes and unsettling odors, and chronometers that inexplicably started to run slow. The great, relentless machine of imperial society continued its endless grinding function, processing citizens through their meticulously assigned roles, rigorously maintaining the quotas and standards that sustained the emperor's vast realm. But deep within that colossal machine, in the shadowy spaces that existed between official acknowledgement and citizen experience, other, darker things continued to grow, to whisper, and to patiently wait. In the abandoned HAB unit, 77 Alpha 9998, The walls still breathed steadily in the profound darkness, and something that was fundamentally never human dreamed of the day when every single HAB unit would echo with chilling voices that spoke only of insatiable hunger and primordial darkness, from the spaces between spaces where the Emperor's light had never, could never, truly reach. The evacuation notices had long since been removed. The building remained officially uninhabitable, a silent, sealed tomb. But on certain desolate nights, when the wind carried faint, unsettling sounds from the hermetically sealed residential complex, citizens in distant sectors reported hearing spectral whispers that seemed to call their very names. Simultaneously, imperceptible cracks began to spiderweb across walls that had stood unmarked and impervious for decades. The average home in the Imperium, Matthias now understood with a profound chill, sheltered far more than its inhabitants ever realized, and some shelters, he suspected, were never, ever meant for human occupancy at all.